The unexpected flight. The hum of the airport was a familiar chaos, a mix of announcements, footsteps echoing off the high ceilings, and the occasional roar of a jet engine. Miss Elizabeth Carter, a celebrated high school teacher, navigated the crowded terminal with her suitcase in tow. Dressed in a sharp yet comfortable outfit, she exuded confidence. Her caramel skin glowed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and her curly hair framed her determined face. Elizabeth was en route to a prestigious education conference in San Francisco, where she would speak on the transformative power of teaching. This trip was a milestone. Months of preparation and anticipation had culminated in this moment. Elizabeth hoped to share her experiences, inspire other educators, and learn from her peers. However, she also carried a hidden burden, a persistent back injury from an old car accident. Though the pain was manageable, long journeys were always a test of endurance. Elizabeth's flight, a packed cross-country trip, was her chance to unwind before diving into the conference. She boarded the plane, greeted the crew with her usual warmth, and made her way to her seat, a middle row, snug but manageable. The cabin was abuzz with activity as passengers jostled to find their seats, stow their luggage, and settle in. Elizabeth noticed the lead flight attendant, a stern-faced woman in her early 40s named Cynthia Harper, moving briskly through the aisles. Cynthia carried an air of authority, but lacked the approachable demeanor Elizabeth was accustomed to in flight staff. Her curt responses to passengers and rigid posture hinted at a long, stressful day. Elizabeth gave it no further thought as she tucked her bag beneath the seat in front of her, adjusted her seatbelt, and prepared for takeoff. As the plane taxied onto the runway, Elizabeth felt the familiar twinge of discomfort in her lower back. She adjusted her seat but couldn't find a position that eased the pain. The flight was expected to last 6 hours, and the thought of enduring it in her current state was daunting. Deciding to seek assistance, she pressed the call button. Cynthia appeared moments later, her expression neutral but her eyes slightly narrowed. "Yes?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Excuse me," Elizabeth began politely, offering a warm smile. "I'm dealing with some back pain and was wondering if you could adjust my seat slightly. Just a small recline would help a lot." Cynthia hesitated. Her eyes scanned Elizabeth briefly, and then she replied, "All seats are locked for takeoff. You'll have to wait." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the regulations. "Of course, I'm aware. I meant after takeoff, if it's possible." Cynthia's demeanor shifted subtly. Her lips tightened, and a flicker of irritation crossed her face. "It's not my job to cater to every individual discomfort," she said, her voice cold. "If you needed special accommodations, you should have booked a different seat." The response was sharp, unexpectedly so. Elizabeth blinked, momentarily stunned. She had spoken politely, as was her nature, and the hostility in Cynthia's tone caught her off guard. "I didn't mean to inconvenience you," Elizabeth said calmly. "It's just a minor adjustment I was hoping for." Cynthia's response came quick, laced with impatience. "This is the way the seats are. Either deal with it or don't fly." The exchange had drawn the attention of nearby passengers, who now watched quietly. Elizabeth, feeling the sting of humiliation, tried to diffuse the tension. "I understand. I only asked because of my back injury, but if it's an issue, I won't insist." Cynthia didn't respond. Instead, she turned sharply and began to walk away, muttering something under her breath. Elizabeth decided to let it go, shifting her focus back to the window. She would manage the discomfort somehow. But before she could fully settle, Cynthia returned, standing over her seat with arms crossed. "You should have mentioned your injury when you booked," Cynthia said, her tone accusatory. "We're not mind readers." Elizabeth looked up, surprised by the renewed confrontation. "I didn't think it would be an issue," she replied, her voice steady but firm. "I only asked for a minor adjustment." The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Elizabeth sensed that this was no longer about the seat, but about something deeper, a power dynamic, a clash of personalities. Then, without warning, Cynthia leaned down and slapped Elizabeth across the face. The cabin went silent. The sound of the slap seemed to echo, freezing everyone in place. Elizabeth's hand instinctively went to her cheek, her skin stinging from the unexpected blow. Her heart raced, and her mind struggled to comprehend what had just happened. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers craned their necks to see what had caused the commotion. A young man in the row across from Elizabeth whipped out his phone, capturing the aftermath on video. Others murmured among themselves, their expressions ranging from disbelief to outrage. Elizabeth stood slowly, her eyes locking onto Cynthia's. She didn't yell or retaliate. Instead, she spoke with a calmness that belied the storm brewing inside her. "I need to speak to the captain," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. Cynthia, realizing the gravity of her actions, tried to backpedal. "It was a misunderstanding," she said hurriedly. "You were being unreasonable, and I—" Elizabeth cut her off. "I want to speak to the captain." Now, passengers around them began to murmur louder. A woman seated a few rows back called out, "You can't treat people like that." Another man shouted, "This is unacceptable." Cynthia's face flushed with embarrassment, but she stood her ground, unwilling to concede. The situation had spiraled out of control, and everyone knew it. The cockpit door opened, and the captain emerged, his expression stern. A seasoned professional in his 50s, Captain Robert Monroe was not one to tolerate disruptions on his flight. He listened intently as Elizabeth explained what had happened, her voice calm but firm. Passengers chimed in, corroborating her account. Captain Monroe turned to Cynthia, his jaw tight. "You need to come with me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The flight attendant's bravado crumbled. She followed the captain toward the front of the plane, her head bowed. Minutes later, she was escorted off the aircraft, her departure marked by a mix of relieved applause and stunned silence from the passengers. As Elizabeth returned to her seat, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She had been humiliated, disrespected, and assaulted, but she had also stood her ground. Around her, passengers offered quiet words of support and understanding, their solidarity a balm for the sting of the slap. The flight was delayed as the airline scrambled to replace the removed crew member. Elizabeth, still reeling from the incident, stared out of the window. What had begun as a routine journey had transformed into something far more significant. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a story that would captivate the nation. The storm begins as the plane sat idly on the tarmac. The cabin buzzed with a mixture of confusion, anger, and curiosity. Elizabeth Carter leaned back in her seat, her hand still lightly touching the cheek where the sting of the slap had lingered. She wasn't sure whether the sensation was physical or emotional anymore, likely a mix of both. Around her, passengers whispered in hushed tones, their gazes flickering toward her as though they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. A few rows ahead, a man in his 20s was already furiously typing on his phone, likely recounting the incident to his friends or posting about it online. Elizabeth noticed other passengers discreetly scrolling through their phones as well. In the age of social media, she realized, moments like this didn't remain private. Her sense of unease deepened. The new flight attendant, a younger woman with a kind but nervous demeanor, approached Elizabeth cautiously. "Miss Carter," she said softly, leaning in so only Elizabeth could hear, "I want to sincerely apologize for what happened. I assure you that our team is taking this very seriously. Can I get you anything? Water? A blanket?" Elizabeth shook her head. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied. Her voice was calm, though inside, she felt anything but. "I just need a moment." The flight attendant nodded and moved on, clearly overwhelmed by the tension in the cabin. Elizabeth appreciated her effort, but knew it wasn't the new attendant's apology she needed. It was accountability from the airline itself. The captain's decision. As the plane's engines idled, Captain Monroe addressed the passengers over the intercom. His voice, steady and authoritative, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to sincerely apologize for the delay. Due to an unfortunate incident, we've had to remove a crew member from the flight. We are currently awaiting a replacement and will resume our journey shortly. Thank you for your patience." The captain's announcement was met with a mixture of murmurs and nods. Some passengers glanced at Elizabeth with sympathy, while others seemed more focused on the inconvenience of the delay. Elizabeth couldn't help but notice how quickly the narrative was shifting for some. It was no longer about what had happened to her, but about how it had disrupted their travel plans. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. How quickly people forget. The viral video. Elizabeth's phone buzzed. She hesitated before pulling it out of her bag, bracing herself for the flood of messages she knew would be waiting. Sure enough, her notifications were out of control. Friends, colleagues, and even acquaintances she hadn't spoken to in years were messaging her. "Liz, are you okay? I just saw the video. What happened? Are you still on the plane? This is insane. You need to speak out about this." Her heart sank as she opened a link sent by a close friend. The video, already making rounds on social media, showed Cynthia leaning in, her hand connecting with Elizabeth's face in a single, shocking motion. The angle was slightly skewed, the footage shaky, but the impact was unmistakable. The caption read, "Flight attendant slaps passenger in unbelievable mid-air altercation." Elizabeth groaned inwardly. The comment section was a battlefield. "This is unacceptable. That flight attendant needs to be fired immediately." What did the passengers say to provoke her, though? We don't know the full story. People are way too sensitive these days. Maybe it wasn't even that bad. She closed the app, feeling a mix of anger and helplessness. The video, though damning, was already being dissected and debated by strangers who had no context for what had happened. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was now a viral spectacle. Confronting the airline. A few minutes later, a man in a crisp suit approached Elizabeth's seat. He introduced himself as Mark Preston, a senior representative for the airline, who had boarded the plane specifically to address the situation. "Ms. Carter," he began, his tone measured and professional. "On behalf of the airline, I want to express our deepest regrets for the incident you experienced today. We are committed to ensuring your safety and comfort for the remainder of this flight." Elizabeth studied him carefully. He was polished, his words rehearsed. "I appreciate the apology," she said, her voice firm but calm. "But words aren't enough. I was assaulted on this plane by a member of your staff. What are you doing to ensure this doesn't happen again?" Mark shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to being confronted so directly. "I assure you, the matter is being taken very seriously. The flight attendant in question has been removed and will face an internal investigation." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "An investigation? That sounds like a way to delay accountability. What about your passengers? The people who witnessed what happened? Are they being informed of their rights if they were affected by this?" Mark hesitated, then nodded. "We'll be issuing a formal statement soon." "That's not good enough," Elizabeth replied, her voice sharpening. "This wasn't just a bad day or a misunderstanding. It was an abuse of power, plain and simple. If I hadn't stood up for myself, what message would that have sent to everyone else on this plane?" Mark seemed taken aback by her resolve. "You're absolutely right," he said finally. "I'll make sure your concerns are escalated to the highest levels. Please let us know if there's anything else we can do to support you." Elizabeth nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. "I'll be following up," she said. "You can count on that." A turning point. As Mark walked away, Elizabeth felt a strange sense of clarity. The incident had shaken her deeply, but it had also awakened something within her, a realization that she couldn't let this moment pass without taking a stand. Too often, people in her position were silenced or dismissed, their experiences minimized. She wouldn't let that happen. The plane finally began to move again, the engines roaring to life. Passengers settled back into their seats, the murmurs of earlier giving way to an uneasy silence. Elizabeth stared out of the window, her mind racing with thoughts of what would come next. She wasn't naive. She knew the road ahead would be challenging. The media would twist the story, the airline would do damage control, and the public would have its opinions. But Elizabeth also knew she had a choice: to retreat into silence or to step forward and make her voice heard. As the plane climbed into the sky, Elizabeth took a deep breath. She had been humiliated, yes, but she wasn't broken. This was just the beginning of her fight, for herself, for others who had been mistreated, and for the principle of respect and accountability. The journey ahead, both literal and figurative, would be far from easy. But Elizabeth Carter was no stranger to adversity. She had faced challenges before and come out stronger. This, she decided, would be no different. The aftermath in the sky. The airplane had finally lifted off, climbing steadily into the clouds. Inside, however, the cabin atmosphere was heavy, taut with unspoken tension. Elizabeth Carter sat quietly in her seat, her fingers gripping the armrests as she tried to center herself. Around her, whispers swirled like a persistent breeze. Although most passengers pretended to focus on their screens or books, their sidelong glances betrayed their curiosity. Elizabeth's phone buzzed again. She sighed, already dreading the notifications awaiting her. She unlocked it reluctantly and was immediately met with a storm of messages from friends, family, and colleagues. The video had gone viral faster than she could have anticipated, and her name was now trending on multiple social media platforms. "Are you okay? I saw the video. Call me ASAP. This is outrageous. Do you want me to connect you with my lawyer? The entire staff at school is talking about it. Stay strong. Liz." Her heart sank as she skimmed through the flood of messages. She had only wanted to attend an education conference to learn and grow as a teacher. Now she was at the epicenter of a social media storm, her name plastered across news outlets and viral hashtags. With trembling fingers, Elizabeth typed a quick response to her closest friend. "I'm okay, but I'll need your help navigating this later." Conversations begin. The new flight attendant, who had replaced Cynthia, approached Elizabeth again. This time, her demeanor was warmer, more personal. She crouched slightly so they were eye level, her soft brown eyes filled with concern. "Ms. Carter," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I just wanted to say I'm so sorry for what happened earlier. That's not who we are as a team. I feel awful that you had to experience that." Elizabeth studied the young woman, whose sincerity seemed genuine. "Thank you," she replied, her voice measured. "But this goes beyond an apology. That was a blatant abuse of power. I'm concerned about how the airline plans to address this, not just for me, but for anyone else who might face such treatment." The flight attendant nodded solemnly. "I understand. I've already reported everything to the captain, and they're working on escalating it. I can promise you that." Elizabeth gave her a faint smile. She appreciated the woman's kindness, but knew the larger issue lay with the airline's culture, which had allowed such behavior to occur in the first place. "Thank you," she said again, "but this isn't over." As the flight attendant walked away, a voice from across the aisle called out, "Excuse me, miss." Elizabeth turned to see a middle-aged man in a business suit leaning slightly toward her. His expression was serious, though his tone was kind. "I just wanted to say I saw everything," he said. "What happened to you was unacceptable. If you need a witness, I'd be happy to provide my statement." Elizabeth's eyes widened slightly. "Thank you," she said, genuinely touched. "That means a lot." Another passenger, a young woman with brightly colored hair, chimed in. "I got part of it on video, too. Not just the slap, but the way she spoke to you before. It's disgusting how she treated you." Elizabeth blinked, overwhelmed by their support. I don't know what to say. "Thank you both." The businessman nodded. "You don't have to say anything. Just know you're not alone in this." The young woman added, "People need to see what really happened, not just that one clip. If you want, I can send you the footage." Elizabeth smiled faintly, her gratitude swelling. I'd appreciate that. Thank you. The ripple effect. As the plane cruised through the sky, the whispers among passengers grew louder. Elizabeth could hear snippets of conversations around her, some supportive, others critical. She handled it so well, someone murmured. Can you imagine being slapped like that in front of everyone? Why didn't the airline step in sooner? But do we know the whole story? Maybe there's more to it. Elizabeth tried to block out the noise, focusing instead on her breathing. She had dealt with judgment and scrutiny before, though never on such a public scale. As a teacher, she had often been in the spotlight, delivering speeches, leading community initiatives, and advocating for her students. But this was different. This wasn't a moment she had chosen to share. It had been forced upon her, and she was struggling to regain control. Her thoughts were interrupted by the crackle of the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice began, "we'd like to thank you for your patience as we work through this unexpected situation. We are currently coordinating with our ground team to ensure all necessary actions are taken upon landing." The announcement was vague, but Elizabeth understood its undertone. The airline was already trying to manage the fallout. She knew what that meant: damage control, carefully crafted statements, and a focus on minimizing liability. But what about real accountability? Would Cynthia face consequences beyond removal from the flight? Would the airline implement changes to prevent this from happening again? Elizabeth wasn't sure, but she intended to find out. A personal reckoning. As the plane continued its journey, Elizabeth leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. The events of the day played over in her mind like a relentless loop. The slap, the shock on the faces of other passengers, Cynthia's defiance, the captain's intervention. She felt a mix of emotions: anger, humiliation, determination. But one thought kept surfacing. This can't happen to someone else. Elizabeth thought of her students, many of whom faced challenges daily: poverty, discrimination, broken systems. She had always taught them to stand up for themselves, to demand respect and fairness. Now she realized she had an opportunity to model that lesson on a much larger stage. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from a national news outlet. The headline read, "Flight Attendant Slaps Teacher in Shocking Mid-Air Incident. What Led to the Altercation?" Elizabeth's stomach twisted. She clicked the link, skimming the article. It summarized the incident, relying heavily on the viral video for context. The language was sensational, the tone speculative. Already, the narrative was being shaped by people who hadn't been there, who didn't understand the nuances of what had happened. Elizabeth closed the article, her resolve hardening. If they want my story, they'll get it. But they'll get the truth. A call to action. As the flight began its descent, Elizabeth stared out of the window at the sprawling city below. The lights twinkled like stars, but they did little to calm her nerves. She knew what awaited her on the ground: reporters, questions, and a media frenzy she hadn't asked for. But she also knew she had a responsibility, not just to herself, but to everyone watching. The plane landed smoothly, and as it taxied to the gate, Elizabeth gathered her belongings. Around her, passengers offered encouraging smiles and words of support. The businessman handed her his business card, and the young woman with the video gave her a quick thumbs up. As Elizabeth stepped off the plane, she took a deep breath. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and airline representatives hovered nearby. It was overwhelming, but Elizabeth held her head high. This wasn't the ending. It was the beginning of a fight for accountability, respect, and change, and Elizabeth Carter was ready. The world watches. The airport terminal was a swirling storm of chaos as Elizabeth Carter stepped off the jet bridge. The usual buzz of a bustling airport was amplified tenfold by the flashing cameras and the sea of reporters gathered near the gate. Their voices overlapped, each one vying to be heard over the others. "Ms. Carter, can you tell us what happened? Do you think the flight attendant should be fired? Are you considering legal action against the airline?" Elizabeth's pulse quickened as she tightened her grip on her carry-on. She wasn't prepared for this. The rapid spread of the incident had turned her into an unwilling celebrity overnight, her face now synonymous with a single moment of public humiliation. Airline representatives flanked her, their professional smiles thinly masking the nervous energy radiating from them. One of them, a tall man in a navy suit, leaned in and spoke softly, his voice tinged with urgency. "Miss Carter, we've arranged a private space for you to gather your thoughts before speaking to the media. If you'd like, we can escort you there now." Elizabeth nodded, grateful for a moment to breathe. "Please." The private room. The airline staff led Elizabeth through a maze of corridors, away from the cacophony of the terminal. They ushered her into a small, quiet conference room with a table, a few chairs, and a window overlooking the runway. A tray of bottled water and snacks sat untouched on the table. She sank into a chair, exhaustion washing over her. Her cheeks still tingled faintly, a physical reminder of the slap that had set all of this in motion. Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment, the events of the day replaying in her mind. The confrontation, the slap, the stunned silence of the passengers. It all felt surreal, like a scene from a movie she didn't want to star in. The door clicked open, and a woman in a sharp gray suit entered. She introduced herself as Karen Porter, a senior executive for the airline's customer relations department. Her demeanor was polished and professional, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. "Miss Carter," Karen began, sitting across from her, "I want to start by apologizing personally on behalf of the airline. What happened to you was unacceptable. We take this matter very seriously and are conducting a full investigation." Elizabeth regarded her coolly. "I appreciate the apology, but I need more than words. I want to know what steps you're taking to ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Karen nodded, folding her hands on the table. "We've already removed the flight attendant from duty pending the investigation. Our policies will be thoroughly reviewed, and additional training for our staff is being implemented." Elizabeth leaned forward, her voice steady but firm. "That's a start, but it's not enough. This wasn't just a bad day for one employee. This is about a culture that allowed her to feel entitled to treat me that way, and in front of an entire plane of witnesses." Karen hesitated, then sighed. "You're right. This incident has exposed deeper issues we need to address. If you're open to it, we'd like to work with you to ensure meaningful changes are made." Elizabeth studied her, searching for sincerity. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But I need time to process everything first." The viral spotlight. After Karen left, Elizabeth turned her attention to her phone. Her notifications had multiplied exponentially in the short time she'd been in the room. News outlets, influencers, and even strangers were tagging her in posts and articles. The video had now amassed millions of views, and the hashtags #RespectElizabeth and #AirlineJustice were trending. She scrolled through the comments, her emotions a roller coaster as she read the words of strangers dissecting her experience. No one deserves to be treated like that. She handled it with so much grace. This is why airlines need to overhaul their customer service policies. Let's not jump to conclusions. We don't know what happened before the slap. Elizabeth paused on one comment that struck a nerve. Why didn't she stand up for herself immediately? She just sat there and took it. Her grip on the phone tightened. She had stood up for herself, just not in the way that some people expected. She hadn't screamed or retaliated physically, but she had demanded accountability. Wasn't that enough? The sound of a knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. A young woman with a badge identifying her as part of the airline's media relations team entered. "Miss Carter," she said hesitantly, "there's a reporter outside who's been particularly persistent about speaking with you. He's from a reputable outlet and wants to share your side of the story. Would you be open to an interview?" Elizabeth hesitated. She had spent her career teaching her students about the importance of standing up for what was right, about using their voices to effect change. Now she was being presented with an opportunity to practice what she preached. "I'll speak with him," she said finally, her resolve hardening. "But only if I can tell the full story, not just what's convenient for the headlines. The interview. The reporter, a man in his early 40s with a calm demeanor, introduced himself as Marcus Bennett from a major news network. They sat across from each other in the conference room, a small camera crew setting up discreetly in the background. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me, Miss Carter," Marcus began. "I know this has been a challenging day for you. Can you walk us through what happened on that flight?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "It started as a simple request. I asked the flight attendant if she could adjust my seat because of back pain from an old injury. Her initial response was curt, but I stayed polite. I never expected it to escalate the way it did." Marcus leaned forward, his expression attentive. "When she struck you, what went through your mind?" Elizabeth paused, the memory vivid in her mind. "I was in shock. It wasn't just the physical act. It was the blatant disrespect. It felt like she wanted to silence me, to assert control. But I knew I couldn't let her actions go unchecked." The reporter nodded. "Since the video went viral, people across the country have been rallying behind you. How do you feel about becoming a symbol for this issue?" "I didn't choose to be a symbol," Elizabeth said firmly. "But if this experience can spark a larger conversation about respect and accountability, then I'll do what I can to contribute. No one, whether they're a passenger, an employee, or anyone else, deserves to be treated the way I was." Marcus's gaze softened. "What do you hope will come from this?" "I hope this incident becomes a wake-up call," Elizabeth replied. "For the airline industry, for anyone in a position of power, this isn't just about one slap. It's about creating an environment where dignity and respect are the norm, not the exception." A glimmer of change. As the interview wrapped up, Elizabeth felt a strange mix of exhaustion and empowerment. She had spoken her truth, and for the first time since the incident, she felt like she was regaining control of the narrative. Later that evening, as she settled into her hotel room, she received an email from the airline CEO. It was a direct and heartfelt message, expressing regret for what had happened and inviting her to participate in a roundtable discussion on improving airline policies. Elizabeth stared at the screen, considering the offer. This wasn't the journey she had planned for, but it was one she was determined to see through. The world was watching, and Elizabeth Carter wasn't about to let this moment pass without making it count. A turning point. Elizabeth Carter sat at the small desk in her hotel room, staring at the email from the airline CEO. It was nearly midnight, but the city outside her window was alive with lights and distant sounds. The events of the day had left her physically and emotionally drained, yet her mind refused to rest. The message before her felt significant, a potential inflection point in a situation that had spiraled far beyond her control. The email read, Subject: a personal apology and an invitation to collaborate. Dear Ms. Carter, I am deeply sorry for the experience you endured on our flight today. As CEO of airline, I take full responsibility for the actions of our staff and the culture that allowed this unacceptable incident to occur. I commend your grace under such challenging circumstances. To ensure that meaningful changes result from this event, I would like to invite you to participate in a roundtable discussion with our leadership team. Your insights could help us create a safer and more respectful environment for all our passengers. I understand this has been a difficult time, and I hope you will consider this invitation. Please let us know your availability at your earliest convenience. Sincerely, Thomas Grayson, CEO, Airline. Elizabeth reread the email, parsing its tone and intent. It was carefully worded, likely vetted by a team of public relations experts, but it still carried an air of sincerity. Was it enough? She wasn't sure. This was about more than an apology. It was about systemic change. Her phone buzzed, breaking her train of thought. It was a video call request from her best friend, Amanda. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before accepting. Liz, Amanda's concerned face filled the screen. Are you okay? I've been following everything online. It's insane. Elizabeth managed a weak smile. I'm holding up, but it's been overwhelming. The airline CEO just emailed me, asking me to work with them on addressing what happened. Amanda's eyebrows shot up. Really? That's huge. Are you going to do it? I don't know yet, Elizabeth admitted. Part of me wants to use this as an opportunity to make real change, but another part of me wonders if they're just trying to control the narrative. Amanda nodded thoughtfully. It's a valid concern, but this could also be your chance to make a difference. You've always fought for what's right, Liz, whether it's for your students or yourself. Maybe this is just a bigger stage. Elizabeth sighed, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. I'll think about it. I just need some time to process everything. Take all the time you need, Amanda said. And remember, you don't have to do this alone. We're all here for you. The power of community. The next morning, Elizabeth woke to a flood of messages on her phone. Among the dozens of notifications, one stood out, a post from a grassroots advocacy group called Respect in the Skies, which worked to address issues of passenger mistreatment and advocate for airline accountability. The group had shared her story, calling it a watershed moment for passenger rights. Their post read, "What happened to Elizabeth Carter is not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem in the airline industry. We stand with Ms. Carter and call for systemic changes to ensure that no passenger faces such mistreatment again. #RespectElizabeth, #accountability now." The post had thousands of likes, shares, and comments, many of which echoed the group's sentiments. Elizabeth was moved by the outpouring of support from strangers who had taken her story as a rallying cry for broader change. Later that day, she received a direct message from the group's founder, a woman named Sophia Chung. "Hi Elizabeth. I hope this message finds you well. I'm Sophia Chung, founder of Respect in the Skies. Your story has struck a chord with so many people, and we'd love to work with you to advocate for stronger protections for passengers. If you're open to it, I'd be honored to discuss how we can support you and amplify your voice. Looking forward to hearing from you. Sophia." Elizabeth stared at the message, feeling a spark of hope. Perhaps this wasn't just about her experience. Perhaps it could become a movement, a meeting with the airline. The following week, Elizabeth found herself seated in a sleek conference room at the airline's headquarters. The room was filled with high-ranking executives, including Thomas Grayson, the CEO. Karen Porter, the customer relations executive she'd met earlier, was also present, along with representatives from the airline's legal and human resources departments. "Ms. Carter," Grayson began, "thank you for coming. I want to reiterate how deeply sorry we are for what happened. Our goal today is to listen to your concerns and discuss how we can move forward." Elizabeth nodded. "I appreciate the invitation, but I'm not here for apologies. I'm here to talk about solutions." The room fell silent as Elizabeth outlined her expectations: mandatory training for all flight attendants on de-escalation and respect, a clear accountability process for staff misconduct, and a commitment to transparency with passengers. "This isn't just about my experience," she said. "It's about creating a culture where incidents like this don't happen. Passengers deserve to feel safe and respected." Grayson listened intently, occasionally taking notes. "Those are fair points," he said. "We've already begun reviewing our policies, but your perspective adds valuable insight. Would you be willing to work with us as a consultant on these initiatives?" Elizabeth hesitated. The offer was tempting, but she was wary of being co-opted into a process that might prioritize optics over genuine change. "I'll consider it," she said finally, "but I'll need to see real commitment from your side first." Building a movement. As Elizabeth left the meeting, her phone buzzed with another message from Sophia Chung. They had scheduled a call for later that evening to discuss potential collaborations. Elizabeth felt a renewed sense of purpose. The incident on the plane had been deeply personal, but it had also opened a door to something larger, a chance to advocate for fairness and accountability on a systemic level. Over the coming weeks, Elizabeth worked closely with Respect in the Skies, lending her voice to their campaigns and participating in public forums. Her story became a catalyst for a broader conversation about passenger rights, with media outlets highlighting not just the slap, but the systemic issues it represented. The airline, under pressure from the public and advocacy groups, announced a comprehensive reform plan that included many of Elizabeth's recommendations. They also implemented a zero-tolerance policy for staff misconduct, with clear procedures for reporting and addressing complaints. A new chapter. Months later, Elizabeth stood at a podium, addressing a packed auditorium at a national conference on passenger rights. Her speech was met with thunderous applause, but what moved her most were the stories people shared afterward. Stories of mistreatment, resilience, and hope. The slap that had humiliated her in front of dozens of passengers had transformed into something far greater. It was no longer just a personal ordeal. It was a rallying cry for change. As she left the stage, Elizabeth felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She hadn't asked for this journey, but she had embraced it. And in doing so, she had turned pain into progress, proving that even the darkest moments could light the way forward. A legacy of change. Elizabeth Carter stood at the window of her classroom, the familiar scent of chalk and books surrounding her. Outside, students bustled through the courtyard, their laughter and chatter weaving a lively tapestry of sound. It was a scene she had cherished for years, but today it carried a new resonance. For the first time since the infamous flight incident, Elizabeth felt like she was returning to her roots, not as a victim or an activist, but as a teacher. The past 6 months had been transformative in ways she couldn't have imagined. What began as a humiliating and deeply personal ordeal had evolved into a national movement for respect, accountability, and reform. Yet, as she prepared for her first day back at school, she couldn't shake the feeling that her journey was far from over. The ripple effect. Elizabeth's story had continued to dominate headlines long after the viral video faded from the front pages. The airline's public commitment to reforms, backed by Elizabeth's consultation, had been widely praised. They had implemented mandatory de-escalation training for all employees, established a passenger rights advisory board, and adopted a zero-tolerance policy for misconduct. But it wasn't just about policies. The cultural shift within the airline industry was palpable. Flight attendants and passengers alike began sharing stories of improved interactions, emphasizing mutual respect and understanding. Elizabeth often heard from strangers who thanked her for her courage and advocacy. One message stood out in particular, a handwritten letter from a flight attendant named Maria. Dear Miss Carter, I've been a flight attendant for 12 years, and I've seen and experienced moments where tensions boil over. Your story reminded us all that every passenger deserves dignity, and so does every crew member. Because of your advocacy, I now feel better equipped to handle challenging situations without losing my humanity. Thank you for standing up for all of us. With gratitude, Maria. Elizabeth had read the letter multiple times, each time feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The slap that once symbolized humiliation now represented the catalyst for meaningful change. Returning to the classroom. On her first day back, Elizabeth was greeted with a surprise. The bulletin board outside her classroom was decorated with messages from her students, colorful notes of encouragement, drawings of airplanes with slogans like "Soaring High with Ms. Carter," and one particularly touching message that read, "You taught us to stand up for what's right. We're so proud of you." Her students' unwavering support brought tears to her eyes. She walked into the classroom, where her homeroom students were seated, eagerly waiting for her. A round of applause erupted as she entered, and Elizabeth couldn't help but laugh. Okay, settle down," she said, raising her hands to quiet the room. "I'm just a teacher, not a celebrity." A hand shot up from the back. It belonged to Jasmine, a bright and outspoken sophomore. "But you are a celebrity, Miss Carter. You're famous. You were on the news and everything." Elizabeth smiled warmly. "I appreciate the excitement, Jasmine, but let me tell you something. Fame isn't what matters. What matters is using our voices to make a difference, whether it's in the classroom, on a plane, or anywhere else." Another student, Malik, chimed in. You made a difference, Miss Carter. You didn't let them get away with what they did. That's brave." Elizabeth nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "Thank you, Malik. But I want you all to remember this. Bravery isn't about never feeling afraid. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." A new opportunity. That afternoon, as Elizabeth was grading assignments, her phone buzzed with a call from Sophia Chang, the founder of Respect in the Skies. Over the past months, Sophia and Elizabeth had grown close, working together to push for broader industry reforms and advocate for passenger rights. "Elizabeth," Sophia began, her voice tinged with excitement, "I have incredible news. Our campaign has gained traction beyond what we imagined. Legislators are now considering a passenger Bill of Rights, and they've invited us to testify before Congress." Elizabeth sat up straight, her breath catching. "Testify? You mean me?" "Yes, you," Sophia confirmed. "Your story is the reason this movement has so much momentum. They want to hear from you directly." Elizabeth felt a surge of anxiety mixed with determination. She had never envisioned herself speaking before lawmakers, but the opportunity to influence national policy was too important to pass up. "When is it?" she asked. 2 weeks, Sophia replied. "We'll prep you beforehand, of course. You'll do great." As she ended the call, Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, staring at the classroom walls adorned with student projects. The thought of addressing Congress was daunting, but she reminded herself of the stakes. This wasn't just about her. It was about every passenger who had ever felt powerless, every employee who had struggled within a flawed system, and every student she had taught to stand up for justice, testifying for change. 2 weeks later, Elizabeth stood in a packed congressional hearing room, her heart pounding as cameras clicked and murmurs filled the air. Seated beside her were Sophia and other advocates, all of whom had worked tirelessly to bring attention to the need for a passenger Bill of Rights. When it was her turn to speak, Elizabeth took a deep breath and approached the microphone. Her voice was steady as she recounted her experience, emphasizing not just the slap, but the broader implications of accountability and respect. "This isn't just about what happened to me," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "It's about creating a culture where every individual, whether they're a passenger, an employee, or a leader, is treated with dignity. We need policies that protect people, but more importantly, we need a shift in how we view and value one another." Her testimony was met with applause, and as she returned to her seat, Sophia whispered, "You nailed it. A legacy in motion." The hearing sparked widespread support for the Passenger Bill of Rights, which was eventually passed, mandating clear accountability measures for airlines and stronger protections for passengers. Elizabeth's role in the movement solidified her as a symbol of resilience and advocacy. Back in her classroom, Elizabeth continued to teach her students not just about academics, but about the power of their voices. Her experience became a lesson in courage, integrity, and the ripple effects of standing up for what's right. Months later, as she watched her students graduate, Elizabeth reflected on how far she had come. The slap that once symbolized humiliation had transformed into a symbol of change, a reminder that even the most painful moments could spark something greater. Elizabeth Carter wasn't just a teacher or an advocate. She was proof that ordinary people could create extraordinary change, and as she looked toward the future, she knew her journey was only beginning.